Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad I made it. I rushed up from mate and I was eating away too much, and then looked at my watch and saw the time. Look, I do have an interest in our movement's identity. I certainly do, and there are probably two characters that are so well known within the Adventist framework: Dr. John Harvey Kellogg and, of course, Ellen White. I'm going to restrict myself to my own notes mostly this afternoon, which is something really strange for me, but it'll keep me on track. I was going to put a cruder title to this book called Ellen White and John Harvey Kellogg, Allies or Enemies. When I started delving into the relationship between these two, I found a whole theme or fabric that I'd never really come across. John was like an adopted son. He really was. I found polarising tensions within Adventism in general regarding John Harvey Kellogg. In fact, when I started researching at the SAM when I was in chaplaincy in the School of Nursing, I wanted to take a book of Kellogg's out of the School of Nursing library that had been stolen. And I thought, okay, and the librarian said, we don't know who took it, but we've ordered another one. And when that arrived, I rang up and they said, it's been stolen too. So I thought to myself, there's the polarisation that takes place. It was like baby bathwater with Dr. John in a certain way. So as a movement, we're heavily moving toward the doctrinal side. I wrote an article called Doctrine versus Deed, or Doctrine and Deed. And I'll get into that as I unwrap a little bit of the relationship. It was a traumatic one for most of the time, but I do believe those years were very crucial in terms. We often think that the pantheism crisis was the big crisis. It was just the flow on some logical thinking of Dr. John. I honestly believe the bigger crisis was Adventist identity at that time. It was whether the church was going to have a clergy-led or a medical-led by Dr. John Harvey Kellogg movement. And it really came down to some interesting things. Can I start, please? And excuse me for reading rid of this, but it'll keep me on track. Two of my favourite authors are Bull and Lockhart. I think they've written probably the best understanding of Adventism from a theological, historical and sociological point of view that I've ever read. And they made this comment: it was never the intention nor was it anticipated that ministers and physicians would eventually represent alternative interpretations of the Seventh-day Adventist tradition. For both were originally destined like harness horses to pull the Adventist carriage at the same speed along the same route. Did you hear what they were just saying there? Both the medical and clergy personnel were equally as important in spreading the church's message, which was intended to combine a distinct theology with a unique health reform emphasis. From the mid-1870s, when Kellogg assumed leadership of the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan, changes became evident, leading to a redefining, or an attempted redefining, of the core of Adventism, including the movement's identity. That grabbed me when I read that. I said, I've got to understand a little more about that. For more than 3 decades, Kellogg played a central role. Most of you will be aware of some of the history of this in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. No one was as meticulously identified with as he was, and this is what struck me with Adventist health teachings. What got him angry was one, and I'm jumping ahead now because I've got it out of my notes, Lyndon, and my students said, get back to your notes. What really aggravated Kellogg, perhaps more than anything else, was that those who were meant to preach an Adventist health message were the worst in their health reform themselves, and he's talking about the clergy. So much so that poor old Dr. John, when he was invited to camp meetings, was always put on the first in the early morning, about 6 a.m, because they got sick of hearing his health message. So he was one of the healthiest characters. He followed. My belief is what John tried to do. We're talking about a moving world at that time in American history. We're talking about on the back of the Civil War, Darwinism, Industrial Revolution floated in a little bit later. We're talking about massive change. I honestly believe in one way, Kellogg was trying to put a scientific basis to Ellen White's visions, but it carried him off in another direction. There's been a book written called The Biological Religion of Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. And I'll share some of his quotes, theological ideas a bit later. But the point that he was so strong with healthful living, and yet the clergy were telling him what he didn't know and what he should know, it became a personal aggravation, as it did with administration. And most of us know there were some big clashes in that area. But if you go back to the relationship with Ellen White and James and young John Harvey when he was 14, he was an intelligent young boy. He would go to Sabbath school and ask the Sabbath school, why? And they said, we don't need to know that. Why are you asking that? You're way too young. And so he wouldn't go to Sabbath school. So he started getting this idea that no one wants to hear, no one wants to listen, no one wants to communicate, no one wants to talk. And he got a bit aggravated with the whole process. So few could match his enthusiasm for ministering to the unemployed, homeless, orphans, captives of liquor. He helped meld Adventist education, public policy, organisation of the church's first medical school, Battle Creek Sanitarium, into an institution with both a domestic and an international reputation. His facile pen, abundant energy, persistent voice, creative imagination made him by 1900 the best-known Seventh-day Adventist, I would suggest, in the world, not just America, because he travelled internationally with his health. Indeed, it was Kellogg's popularity that I think got in the craw of a lot of Adventists. We're come out of, we're come away from. We don't need this person interfacing with society. That's not how it should be. But he trod the halls of senators, educators all over the place. And I think some people got really upset that he did that. He was much more than just a cereal maker. I've often thought, what it'd be like to stand in at Morisset, Morisset Woolworths, where you've got Sanitarium health food and Kellogg cornflakes, and just stand there and say, would you like to know the story of the history of the fallout between these two? I'm sure people would say, get lost. No, we don't want to know. He was an Adventist giant, folks. He was a surgeon, an inventor, a dietitian, an editor, a lecturer, a preacher, a physician, a religious leader, and author of some of the titles that the doctor assumed. So he interfaced with the world in which no other Adventist did. No other Adventist did. Indeed, for more than 50 years, he was a visible entity in American public life. His early contacts with leading European physicians, Mortimer Granville, London, in Paris, Bill Roth in Vienna, engaging in scientific discussion. No one else in our Adventist movement was doing it like that. He could move freely among the captains of industry, government leaders, and national and international figures wherever he went. He had a framework. He cultivated accepted opportunities to spread the Adventist health ideals and reforms. Salt Lake City, mind you. Hello? Salt Lake City. City Mormon's Tabernacle, where he addressed 7,000 people at the request of the Mormon Church president. Little Dr. John did. YMCAs all over the place. The well-known Battle Creek Sanitarium, which he directed for 67 years. Can you imagine it? Became a favourite retreat for many prominent in American society. The admission list, tycoons, John D. Rockefeller, Montgomery Ward, J.C. Penney, Alfred Dupont, and etc., etc. Kellogg's passion for professional contact and dialogue with fellow doctors and scientists never, ever diminished. That's part of his framework. But despite his notable inconsistencies, he was highly influential with his ideas, research and writings. And he influenced not just Adventists, but the health habits of the United States citizens. Amazing legacy. Now, I'd gone in the baby bathwater trip with Kellogg. I'm not saying, hey, John, all this. But I had misunderstood him myself. He'd be an interesting character to sit down with at a table. Oh, what would you talk about? When he died, December 14, 1943, a number of tributes was received from people from all walks of life. The Secretary of the US Navy, Frank Knox, perhaps summarise the thoughts of many when stating this, I quote, "The sudden passing of Dr. Kellogg robs this country of its greatest individualist and leader in medicine." I'm going, really? "His contribution to national health and well-being was very great, and he will be long remembered." Long remembered. But, having said all this, he's just remained a controversial character all his life, particularly after his life. Individuals hold the polarising views. It'd be interesting to see what this group here thinks of it. They either loved him or loathed him. It was that divisive. Richard Willis, author of the Kellogg Imperative, states that many individuals came to regard Kellogg as both egotistical and bombastic in his style. But friend and foe alike could not ignore or disregard his passion and enthusiasm for his vocation as a practitioner, reformer and health writer, health foods, etc. In the contemporary current world of Seventh-day Adventism, Kellogg's legacy remains or continues to remain somewhat disputed, doesn't it? It does, it certainly does. And his health reform sort of being diminished and marginalised due to, in particular, his pantheistic ideas, expressed most prominently in the Living Temple, and then his expulsion from the church in 1907. It would appear, now this is an interesting quote, "It would appear that Kellogg's theological aberrations and membership termination from the church have been perceived as far more serious than his health reform advocacy principles were deemed beneficial." Do you get that point? His theological heresies have been deemed by the church much more devastating than the positives that came from his health reform ideas. And that challenged me. I wanted to understand that a bit more. His ongoing battle with Ellen, with church administrators in leadership, cast a shadow on many of the profound things that he had done, contributions he'd made. Richard Schwartz, I think, has done more research into Kellogg than anyone I've read. Extensive research on Kellogg shapes that classic Shakespearean quote when assessing the perceptions of most Seventh-day Adventists towards the health reformers' contribution. "The evil that men do lives after them, and good is often interred with their bones." So my suggestion this afternoon is, folks, and I'm still doing this in a way, is to be a little bit more reluctant in taking on the broad views of the many, or the few even, and saying, go and have another look. Go and have another look. Therefore, to the majority of Adventists, Schwartz insists Kellogg remains a dishonourable figure, disconnected with the golden days of the Battle Creek Sanitarium and development of early health foods. For others, his organisational controversies and theological aberrations have left a tarnished memory and is just best forgotten. Today, Kellogg's immense efforts to initiate Seventh-day Adventists in a wide-ranging program for alleviating many of America's society's social life remains somewhat unnoticed. And Schwartz concludes, it goes along with the old adage, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And that was the challenge I was facing when I looked at what was going on here. So this whole question of identity rose up. What were the mechanisms that were fighting against each other? And I started looking into some previous work that I'd done, and I asked myself again the question, folks, how do you define a Seventh-day Adventist? How would you define it? How would you define a Seventh-day Adventist? If you approached any Adventists from around the regions of the world today, there's so much variety culturally. Some might suggest, well, I believe in the seventh-day Sabbath and the second coming, both inherent in the name, the literal return of Jesus. It would be interesting if anyone were to say, well, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is one of the most wealthiest, constantly developing multinational movements with huge, significant organisational and institutional structures that appear to be succeeding quite well in today's society, but would be nonetheless totally foreign to the pioneers. And so automatically, that's the sociological lens I'm starting to put on. I'm saying sociology looks at beliefs, but also looks at function. So the doctrine and deed idea intimacy, preaching intimacy, and I've talked of this before, and occupancy. How do you handle those tensions? When Ellen White said, not that long after the disappointment, time's no longer a test, Ellen and James decided to get married, did they cop it? What? Sister White, the Lord's coming. You can't get married. Well, we don't know that really. So what do you do in the meantime? We develop this big bureaucratic structure, which is fine. But it's also been noted, and I put it on page 33, and this is a classic comment. Where is it? I should remember this. Institutionalisation is necessary of religious movements, but also detrimental to those same movements. Oh. You think of the day of Pentecost. How many were baptised? What's the next question you ask? What do we do now? As soon as you ask that question, you start making formalisation. We've got to meet, we've got to house, we've got to feed, and you start the structures. Institutionalisation, it's not bad. It's just that as a church, what I find interesting is we'll spend most of our energies looking at our belief systems, but rarely do we spend the same amount of time saying, how do we function in relation to our belief systems? So our pioneers preached immediacy. We still do, you hear it. But we're a long way down the track from that. We're now into occupancy with a little bit of immediacy. I'm not being crude with this, folks. There are real tensions that we have to sometimes struggle with. And I'll hear people saying, we need to preach this more. I want to see how we function as a movement, as much as I love my beliefs, but I want to see how we function. What happens in real time, tangible time? I didn't finish that quote. Institutionalisation is necessary of religious movements, but also detrimental to those very same movements. Therefore, an analysis of the effects of institutionalisation should observe not only what it does for the church, but what it does to the church. Do we hear that? It's a real process that every movement that wants to live beyond the first generation has to navigate. They either die or they have to find a way to continue to navigate in the world in which they live. So we erect forms, institutions. That is not bad. But what we need to do is look at how that impacts how we're going, how we're moving, how we're functioning. And is there any tension there? I was interested in, I'm going to cut a couple of things out. Of the 200, this is interesting, of the 275 countries and regions of the world recognised by the United Nations, Adventists have a presence in 215. Okay? The Adventist educational system boasts almost 10,000 schools globally, with a total enrolment of over 2 million, it'll be more than that now. Healthcare facilities include over 230 hospitals, 133 nursing homes, retirement centres, clinics, and it goes on and goes on. Publishing houses, etc., etc., etc. The GDP register, the Gross Domestic Product register by both the United States and the World Bank, lists 193 countries on its database, with the United States ranked first and Tuvalu, small Polynesian nation located in the Pacific Ocean, ranked last. Grab this. If the SDA Church were deemed a nation, it would rank 159 out of 193 in relation to income through tithes and offerings alone. Fascinating, isn't it? That's not talking about other finances. Placing the church's financial income above nations such as the Solomon Islands, Tonga, Samoa, Liberia, Andorra, Burundi, Greenland. So all I'm saying is that's not bad, but we need to look how that affects the way we function and journey. So Adventists, where did I go? Did I get to the right place? Yes, I'm moving on. So there's a bit of a context for us, the struggle that we go through. When John Harvey Kellogg came onto the scene with the health reform movement, America was busting at the seams in intellectual ways. The reform mania, it was called, was endemic across the American landscape. And it was totally absorbed in a post-millennial mindset, theological mindset, which means The world, America, will be the front runner in this. We will create such a peaceful environment that the Lord will simply have to come and it's all good. We've got it worked out. What got William Miller into trouble, do you think? Well, I know he talked about 1844 and this sort of thing, but he cut across the grain of conventional thinking. What did Miller come out and say? It's not going to happen like that, folks. The Lord's just going to cut in and finish it. And they went, what? We're getting better. So reform mania was driving the whole process. Social imperfections, individual imperfections were obstacles to its realisation, had to be eradicated. The majority of the Americans living during this time agreed with the optimistic post-millennial interpretation of the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation in the tradition of Jonathan Edwards and company, that the second advent would occur only after peace and prosperity had been achieved on earth through the agency of human beings. Premillennialism cut right through that. It said, it's not getting better. It's just getting worse. Thus, for many Americans, they firmly believed their home would be the ideal society. Look, somewhere in my DNA, I still hear that cry in America now. We've got to get back. We've got to get back to what God originally gave us. We're going to lead the world. We're going to make America great again. I'm hearing this sort of rhetoric, and I'm going, that smacks of this conversation that presidents would stand and talk. The lion will lay down with the lamb when we get all this together. And I'm going, wow, that's really interesting. The thought of new national utopia reforms appealed and excited many, and they all got on board, most did. Finally, the proclamation could ring out through the nation that the millennial dawn was on the horizon, and in the classic biblical language from the book of Revelation, I just mentioned it, the lion and the lamb would at last lie down together, led by America. So this was a part of the context. These ideas would become significant in the development of health reform. So what did I do? I know Lyndon, you and Wendy and a few others have written a book on health. Or Wendy, remind me what that one you worked on years ago.
It was actually edited by
It was a history of aspects of our health movement.
And that stimulated my thinking to go back and have a look at what was health like in mid-19th century America. I just couldn't believe it. Let me find a page. The age of quackery. I'm going to miss some of this stuff. Numbers wrote a fair bit on this, but the prevailing conditions were just terrible. What amazes me is how quick reform came. Someone said, knowledge shall increase. Unbelievable. In 50 or 60, I cannot believe what took place with civil war, Darwinism, and then within a mere few decades, Industrial Revolution, and we had this onslaught of thinking that we'd never seen before. And I'm just bloodletting. I'm just seeing some of the words on the page here. Most medical courses, grab this, consisted of 3 or 4 months before you could practice. Just find your local GP, folks, and go for it. It cannot be assumed that the practice ever really improved. In fact, recovery was quite rare. Commentary, I was reading this, I said, you're serious? Common treatments included bloodletting. When does your bloodletting stop? When you die?
Run out.
Oh, obviously they're not getting better. The application of leeches, well, we know that can still work a little. Purging vomiting along with drugs, strychnine, chamomile. For all its apparent vitality, America in the early 19th century was just a sick and dirty nation, one person wrote. Quackery flourished at the time. Here I come. A brief perusal of the recommended treatments for prevailing ailments at the time reveal a plethora of medical folklore options. Here's some of them. Tobacco was recommended for any lung problem. The vapour to be produced by smoking a cigar. This is quote, to achieve the greatest benefit, the patient should frequently draw in the breath freely so the internal surface of the air vessels may be exposed to the action of the vapour. Are you serious? Lung problem, smoke. I would love any of you to walk into a doctor's today, I've got a lung problem, but I've got something that's going to fix it up. What would they say to you? To treat an earache. blow the smoke of tobacco strongly into the affected ear. To cure baldness, rub the head morning and evening, first with onions until the head is red, and then with honey. I'm serious, I'm just reading directly here. To treat worms, I'm sure you've enjoyed about this. Patient must swallow a teaspoon of molasses mixed with a teaspoon of tin rust. To stop a nosebleed, patient must chew a newspaper. Or hold a dime on the roof of the mouth. Can you imagine going into your doctor and getting prescribed this? With tongue for a few minutes, or wrap the little finger with a thread. So it was just quackery ran the whole thing. And then we have this discussion with John Harvey Kellogg, Ellen White, about health reform, Adventists coming on the scene with her visions. John wanting to say, John actually said, I follow these visions in his early days very closely. I'm one of the very few Adventists, he would say, that actually follow her admonition. And as I mentioned, that's what really got him upset with the clergy. Because there was one camp meeting he was on early, and he was teaching, he was just exploiting the downside of non-vegetarianism, meat eating. And then he found out that they were selling, we call it the tuck shop, what we call it the shop at the camp meeting. They're selling all these meat products. So John went and bought a lot of them. It's in my book. He bought a lot of them and took them down to the river with some meat and threw them all into the river, the whole lot. He dispatched them in the river. And then the next day someone came and said, Dr. John, some of the ministers have gone down and found the food you threw in the river and they're cooking it. It's true. So you can see why the guy got a little bit aggravated. How dare the Adventist clergy lead this church? So I think personality issues got really big in this, between John and Ellen and administrators and that. And my gut feeling after looking at all this is that overtook anything else. It was those personal, but he was moving in one direction. Can I use the sociological terms? He was trying to de-sectarianise Adventism. Sect's not a negative term in that language, but he was trying to know we're not going to teach Adventist specifics in the Battle Creek Sanitarium. I'll get to a couple of quotes where he and Ellen White really came to not quite blows on this, but really significant things. Where am I up to? You tell me when to stop. I've got it all lined up here and I can't. Here we go. Yeah, in 1893, the Seventh-day Adventist Medical, Missionary and Benevolent Association was established by the General Conference Seventh-day Adventist Church in Battle Creek, Michigan, under the leadership of Kellogg, who, apart from White, influenced, as we know, the global development of Adventism and the philosophy of Advent. What was Ellen White's philosophy? It was a great controversy thing. It didn't originate with her. Joseph Bates got the germ of that going, but she took it in directions much further than that. Historically, John Harvey was undoubtedly, I mentioned, the most recognised Adventist. He was a great biostatistician. By 1896, the medical leaders at Battle Creek voted, this is important, 1896, got the date, the medical leaders at Battle Creek voted successfully for a name change of the organisation that substituted Seventh-day Adventist, now you may say, well, what's in a word? Grab this, to international. The rationale for this change of wording was designed to reflect the increasingly global scope of Adventist growth. However, another reason for the name change was provided 2 years later in an issue of Medical Missionary by Dr. John Kellogg, and this is what he said. The International Medical Missionary and Benevolent Association is a unique organisation in the fact that it is, as far as we know, at least the only association which is undertaken to organise and carry forward medical and philanthropic work independent of any sectarian or denominational control. Or in home and foreign lands. Tensions became apparent quite quickly with that. between church ministers, administrators, Ellen White and John Harvey Kellogg, concerning the word denominational when applied to the function and operation of the association. The agents of the Medical Missionary and Benevolent Association insisted that their existence centred on being here as Christians and not Seventh-day Adventists. Do you get that slide? Change of focus? In a similar vein, in 1899, at a convention of the association, the delegates declared that their purpose was not to present anything, in quote, that is peculiarly Seventh-day Adventist in doctrine, unquote. Rather, their work was, quote, simply the undenominational side of the work of Seventh-day Adventists which they have to do in the world. So they're pretty significant statements when you go home to bed and lie on that and think, what's that actually mean? For many Adventists at the time, this number of declarations by Kellogg and associations that continued to surface was creating a real sense of alarm, and they were thinking, what is he trying to do? And then he authored another article called Fraternity and Mission Work, in which he made a plea for recruits to become properly trained medical missionaries, including both physicians and nurses, and made the following observation: 100 could be set to work in this country alone. Such missionaries are wanted. Grab this. If you're a minister, grab this. Not to engage in proselytising men and women to a creed, not to the purpose of disseminating doctrines, but to help lift fallen men and women to a higher moral level through the alleviation of their physical sufferings. Can you see the divergence going on here? And the amelioration of their physical wants and necessities. If Christians would only tear themselves away from the narrowness of self and their church bigotry. These are strong words, folks. You're not discussing this around the dinner table, I don't think. And the bigotry of church pride and denominationalism, and devote themselves to the earnest work for their fellow men, the gibes of the infidel and the scorner would soon be silenced. He set his sail in a totally different direction. It was a good direction, you know, to help alleviate the suffering. But where Ellen got really worried was the theological mooring of the Adventist Church was being defaced or obliterated. And she couldn't quite see it. In her understanding of the great controversy theme, which is basically restoration, she saw the two working together. Kellogg was saying, not with the clergy attached, they're not going to run this place. And it just started developing into heavier personal anxieties and tensions. While vehemently opposed to Kellogg's and the association view that the American Medical Missionary College was being announced to the world as providing an undenominational charter, shortly after the opening of the medical school, Ellen White wrote a letter to the medical superintendent of the sanitarium, emphasising in no uncertain terms that, quote, the remnant people of God were to glorify God's name by proclaiming the last message of warning, and the only method in which God's remnant Adventists could achieve this goal was by being representatives for the truth at this time. So can you see the pangs of tension driving right through the system here? While in the same letter she commended, and this is where I honestly believe Ellen really struggled with John, because she'd nurtured this young chap through for many years, and it was like an adopted son who she saw felt was just starting to move way up there, way off track. While in the same letter she commended Kellogg for having once, quote, stood notably for the faith once delivered to the saints, she insisted that he was now facing his sternest test ever. And Kellogg's dangerous position was described by White. She said, I saw you holding up the banner on which are written the words, here is the patience of the saints, here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. Several men, some of them with whom you are connected in the sanitarium, are presenting a banner which is a different inscription. You are letting go of the banner of Seventh-day Adventism. Ooh. I was instructed that you and your fellow labourers were in danger of hiding the principles of faith in order to obtain large patronage. So it's an interesting dilemma, isn't it? Every jot done in this line, and instead of extending the influence of truth, will simply hinder its advance. So White provided further admonition insisting that no concealing of any distinctive truths of Adventism would be countenanced except at a severe cost. She declared there would be no covering up of any phase of our message in any of our institutions. Wow. No narrowing down. The truth of this time must be given for souls needed. I wanted to go to... No, I'll just finish this. How long have I got? Am I still going all right? Just tell me. By 1906, the escalation of tensions between the key leaders of Adventist medical work were located primarily in Battle Creek under Kellogg's influences. And the church leaders who were primarily from a ministerial background, the tension has escalated to the point where irreparable rupture and separation would occur. Such was the struggle that the burgeoning question at the commencement of the 20th century in Adventism was whether the movement would remain clerically dominated or follows Kellogg's mandate for a medicalised version of Seventh-day Adventism. That's seen by some authors as the big issue, which direction it was going to take, which version of Adventism would win, which was fundamentally different from the church leadership and mainstream membership. Pardon me. Kellogg advocated a social gospel devoid of sectarian... Here's it in a nutshell. Kellogg advocated a social gospel devoid of sectarian constraints, arguing that being a good Samaritan in society was much more important than being a good theologian or a minister, and that humanitarian work would prove much more successful for the Adventist cause than all the efforts of the church's clergy combined. Whoa. Preach it, John. They're big comments. You know, he's basically saying, clergy, you've got no... He just got very exasperated, and they did so with him. What does the church do with those tensions? Ultimately, Kellogg set the medical world at odds with both the church administrators and ministry, declaring that the medical world would become independent of denominational control. Where is our medical work today, mostly in the Western world? Who controls that now? Mostly hospital boards, etc. What I find interesting, is in the Western world, where, you know, I trained at the Sydney Adventist Hospital, and that's where I was going to originally do my research on what makes the Sydney Adventist Hospital Adventist. I wanted to study the ethos, what's in the walls, because people would say, oh, it's changing. Oh, I've heard that about Avondale University. Oh, it's changing. It's, you know, it's going backwards. We're not, you know, all of that sort of thing. I said, how do you measure that? How do you measure that? And I remember when, up until about I started in 76, up until the mid-70s, we used to have the hydrotherapy rooms. In fact, as nurses, we had to learn all the massage and do all, it was good in that sense. But you know what? In the history of the Adventist Church, Battle Creek, etc., it has never paid for itself. So when did the Sydney Adventist Hospital go acute care? In the late 70s, to financially find its way. Michael Bevan, I think it's Michael Bevan, wrote a paper saying he wanted to address the question of, do Adventists ever proselytise in their medical institutions? Is that how we sort of think? Do Adventists out there think that our hospitals are becoming a saving mechanism or something? And his research said he has found nothing to suggest. There may be a person say, I like what your food, but there is no real research out there to suggest that it's ever been an agency for bringing members into the church. Mm. And I think to myself, John Harvey Kellogg pushed the Good Samaritan line devoid of Adventist theology. And Ellen was saying we need to have our theology right front and centre, and the Good Samaritan, other people are doing that also, and that's got to complement, you know, the arm, the body sort of idea. And John said, no. It's the other way around. But there's no proof, I found no proof there anywhere, that it's ever been considered a special Adventist proselytising place where people will come in, you know, Bible study. And so I just wonder, historically, have we thought the wrong things about our institutions sometimes? Whether we sort of think, well, why do they exist? good examples. So in another way, I'm thinking, well, John was okay in that point. Was John okay in letting go all of his theology, or putting making it non-sectarian? This is not an Adventist institution, and I could see why the tensions rose up, because Ellen's great controversy pushed her to the point where she said, we cannot lose the distinctives for which we were founded and what we need to be doing. But how do you measure that in an institution? How do you measure that? Let me go. Can I just share with you a couple of quotes? Ellen White's Health Reform. I think we know that the great controversy was central to her understanding. It was the conceptual key for everything that Ellen White, how life began, why suffering occurs, but recent authors suggesting John's theme was biological living. We can get to the point in our health. Well, I'm going to read a couple of quotes, so I'm going right to them now. If I can find them, where did I write them? Bear with me, folks. It's in here somewhere. As always, isn't it, when you... Oh, here we go. Nebraska Conference, 1987. John's still with us. 1897. White opened a letter from Dr. Kellogg where he outlined the implications of his developing theology. I want you to note this, regarding biological living. Okay? He wrote that those ready for Christ when he comes will be above the power of sin, including all disease. And this condition will be achieved by obedience to the truth. He maintained that the sealing of God is both a moral and physical change which takes place in the individual as a result of adhering to truth which shows in their body. Indeed, the seal of God, and furthermore the mark of the beast, is the mark of the work of the beast in the heart and changes the body as well as the character, and it shows in one's countenance. You're getting the drift there in these theological sort of ideas. The implications were obvious. Satan's seal was simply a physical ugliness in an unhealthy body. It's classic, isn't it? Whereas the seal of God places human beings on an outward mark of their worthiness for salvation is physical health and beauty. These themes, Kellogg insisted, should be the focal point of Seventh-day Adventist theology. So I can just see the tensions. It seems to me, he wrote, our people have been wrong in regarding Sunday listen to this. Quote, it seems wrong that our people have been wrong regarding Sunday observance as the sole mark of the beast. The mark of the beast is simply a changing character in our body that comes from surrender to the will of Satan. The true seal of the remnant people was not to be specifically associated with anything to do with Sabbath or worship or any identifying mark of the elect. Rather, it's the seal involved in the physical and moral perfection that comes from biological living. So, in your thinking, where's John moved to? You know, so... And I still live with that tension as I look at Ellen White and John Harvey Kellogg. Say, John did more than probably any other American to alleviate the Chicago slums. You know, you read through how many they fed a day, the lives that were lost, murders, and how he alleviated all of that. But this huge tension came in over that were considered theological aberrations that were quite different from where Adventist theology was. And I said, boy, I wish we could rewrite. Can we just turn back the tape and see if we can do it another way? So how do you come down with, how do you end up? What do you think about John Harvey Kellogg? Couple more things. The 1897 General Conference, he went one step further in another lecture on the physical basis of health. Can you imagine this at 6 a.m. in the morning? I know we have camp meetings now. Who goes to the 6 a.m? I don't know, but on this occasion, his theology became more radicalised when he declared the physical perfection provided the potential for the elect to actually escape death. The only thing necessary for a man to live forever is an abundance of life. this would sell so well today. This John, if we had it all through time, we'd live forever. How is this abundant life achieved? Through dietary practices. That is, death results primarily through the consumption of flesh foods, whereas indefinite life is only available through a vegetarian diet. Thus, if only, quote, human beings would restrict themselves to a vegetarian diet, their lives would never end. Adventists, we've lost the plot. But look, we can laugh about it, but in all seriousness, I honestly feel John's been thrown out with the bathwater many times. He brought so much, but we sort of concentrate on those last few. What I'm really interested now is, at the time he was living, which he died during, what was it, 1947? 43, which was very close to the Second World War. And Hitler had a fashion in Hitler had a passion for eugenics. So did Kellogg. And I'd love to research whether there's any, at that time. But that's another story. So he was disfellowshipped, lived another 30 years.
Why didn't he live forever if he was vegetarian?
Yeah. The ramifications of his divine image and theology could be felt throughout the Adventist movement. I mean, if someone gets up and preaches that in a pretty traditional Adventist church, they're not going to stay there too long. The implications were so broad that it impacted virtually every tenet of SDA faith, including doctrines, the nature of sin, seal of God, Sabbath and servant. But Kellogg was convinced that the theology of divine immanence provided the missing link in Adventist theology by achieving the amalgamation of doctrinal integrity with scientific inquiry. I've got to give Kellogg his dues. His logic that took him to where he was continued to take him to where he went. He was honest to his logic. And so, yeah, Lyndon?
No one would ever accuse Kellogg of being simplistic, easy to understand, or even of having a high degree of coherence, I suspect. But that's another thing. I'm going to give you a moment or two to think of your questions. There's an offering bag on each side at the front. I'm going to ask those people closest to them to just pick them up and hand them around. Our expenses for meetings like this are not high, but we still think of bringing people over from Europe or the States to do something with us for Forum. It's obvious from our turnout this afternoon that people are still interested in coming to hear something that challenges them and makes them think. On that topic, just let me mention that the other Forum meeting that we have gazetted for this year is on October 26th, and it's going to be taken by David Thiel. It arises out of an interesting circumstance when Rainer Brunsma came and took meetings for us at the beginning, I think, of last year. One of the possible topics that he could have addressed us on was the relevance of Revelation. I suggested, in fact, that he might want to choose that topic, but he chose to speak on aspects of relevance and developmental sociology with respect to the church, so that was the most interesting talk. But I was talking to David about it a little bit later on, and expressing my frustration as every 5 or 6 years or so over the last 30 or 40, I have gotten to the point where I've thought, I really ought to spend a bit more time with Revelation. It's so important, and I understand so little of it. And then after a little while of that, I throw it away in frustration, as I've done at least a dozen times before, saying I can't make any headway with this stuff. It doesn't seem relevant at all to the way I live, the decisions I have to face. And I was crying on David's shoulder, and he said, well, I may be able to help you. So he is going to give a talk addressing the topic of why Lyndon should read the book of Revelation. I wish him all the very best. But that's what he's undertaken in a weak moment to give us. and I do look forward to it. I mean, what a book! It says it's important. I am used to saying this to my students: this is important, but I try and make it understandable for them, and that's the tension that I face. So October 26. We're not exactly sure that it will be here. We're chasing that. There is a prior booking apparently for the weekend, and we have to make sure that this is actually going to be used. If so, we may go to Lecture Theatre 2 or somewhere like that. But the advertising that goes out will make that venue perfectly clear. All right. Rick will get you to come back up again and face a few questions. It's 4 o'clock. We'll take questions till about 20 past. I'll lead off with one, if I might. It's obvious, at least it seems obvious to me, that Kellogg, despite the fact that we threw him out, so to speak, and for reasons that I, for one, don't have difficulty understanding, some of the excesses to which you alluded seemed to me to be a little bit beyond where I would have felt comfortable had I been a church administrator at that time. And yet it seems to me that he has had residual and ongoing success, at least as far as our medical work is concerned. I can remember when I was a student, the Sydney Adventist Hospital was one place where, for example, senior figures earned a lot more than the division wage scale allowed, where things happened on Sabbath that would never have happened at Avondale or at Lilydale or perhaps even up at the Charles Harrison, where dietary freedoms existed to a far greater extent than would have been the case here at Avondale, for example, where I got into trouble once in a hypothetical by pointing out that while the college didn't serve meat in the cafeteria, we did fatten vealers on the paddocks down near the creek. And so I make those points to seemingly demonstrate that as far as the medical work is concerned, the kind of picture of helping people to feel good about themselves, to be healthy, and to feel good about us because we gave them such wonderful care, which seems to me still a defining characteristic of the SAH. People don't come away saying, you know, I learned about this fundamental or that. They came away saying, I was just so fantastically cared for. So my question is really a series of observations more than a question, but a comment.
Oh, look, I know from my days of training, we work in this cultural milieu, which I sometimes don't think we understand how that impacts us as institutions. And the Sydney Adventist Hospital, for example, works on the interface where we don't operate here the same way. I mean, they're getting folk from around Sydney particularly walking through their doors. They're meeting a different clientele totally. They're on the interface with society. I can remember in nursing, I don't think meat was allowed. A surgeon could sign off, I think, if a patient wanted meat back in the 60s or 70s. I'm not sure how it functions down there in terms of that, but I remember the florist shop couldn't open and the cafe, I'm not sure what happens in that. But are you sort of suggesting, have things changed? Do we see change? I see a lot of change taking place over time, and some people get really upset with that because that's not Adventist. At the same time, you've got a function in a world where you've got people travelling all around New South Wales coming to visit patients and that, and they need care and they need things. So I don't know if I'm answering it right, Lynn, but I sometimes feel that when I was down there studying, people would say, this is how it used to be and that's how we loved it. And I'd say, can you explain that? No, not really. But we knew we knew that person, we knew that. Now the employment is largely non-Adventist because of medical care that's expected. And so the dynamics change with all of this sort of thing all the time. I think we place too much of a burden on ourselves in expectancy of what it should be.
All right. I've only got the one microphone selected, so perhaps it would be smart for me to bring it and we'll get you to hold it, Rick, as you've answered
A question that I can...
just said to Rick, it's not really a question, it's a little bit of a story to add to your great story. Thank you. My grandfather, Christopher Vince, so some of you might know my dad, Ron Vince. So his father in England moved to Battle Creek as a carpenter to help rebuild the sanitarium. And I think it was in 1902, we've got our family history right, he moved there. Had their first 3 children, so my father's eldest siblings were born in Battle Creek. One of them died and is in the same cemetery where the other church pioneers are. The outcome of that is, they then went back to England, but my grandfather's brother, who was a dentist, was then invited by Dr. Kellogg to work with him at the Battle Creek Sanitarium as the dentist, and he did that for 13, 15 years, but stayed in Battle Creek as the dentist until he retired and then finally died in the early 50s. So we have an interesting family link, if you like, to the Battle Creek Sanitarium. But I wanted to tell you this additional piece of the story. My great uncle, the dentist, living in Battle Creek, had a boarder by the name of Lena Frances Cooper. And our family history research has found that she in fact lived with the dentist, our great uncle, while she was working as the dietitian, or they didn't call them dietitians back then, but as home economist for the hospital. She was in charge of developing the vegetarian menus, working with John Harvey Kellogg. Lena Frances Cooper went on to be the co-founder of the American Dietetic Association, which today is the largest nutrition and dietetic association in the world, with over 90,000 members. So she came from the Battle Creek culture, if you like, vegetarian culture. One other little story, if I may. Sorry if I'm going on too long, but you were talking about quackery. We've got a lot of misinformation in nutrition. Some of you know I'm a dietitian, worked at the hospital, worked at sanitarium, lots of nutrition misinformation. One of the interesting stories back in Ellen White's time is she was very against eating cheese. And I have done a recent little bit of research and came across this interesting little piece of story that in Europe, of course, they had perfected the art of making cheese. In America, they hadn't got it right yet. So they added arsenic to cheese to stop it from rotting and over-fermenting. So no wonder she said, don't eat cheese. Fortunately, after that, Kraft bought the cheese-making process, and of course then it became a highly processed product, which you don't want to eat. But now today, cheese is a much better product.
Not that you probably don't need to make a comment.
No, I think sometimes too with Ellen, we put her in a box, we sometimes box Ellen White in as saying certainly, and she's very much a pragmatist, I found in a daily stuff, but Europe was way ahead of America. That's why Kellogg would go to Europe so often for the water treatments, and that was taken off in America. But he was itching. He'd go over there and see the treatments that they were doing, and try and come back and get it all going. And that got him frustrated because he could see the benefits of all that. But Europe was way ahead of us.
Rick, thank you for your presentation. You had tight camera focus on the Adventist situation. I'm always fascinated when the camera is brought back further, because this must be happening at the same time in America that you have on the one hand the fundamentalists,
yes,
the Scotch Monkey tribe, and also the social gospel movement, which Kellogg would seem to fit into. Can you reflect for us a little on the connections between the Adventist history and the wider history, or if you've given some thought to it?
Probably not as much as you have, David, but that was the flux at the time. I don't know that history had moved so quickly. The modernist movements of 1910, they were all coming a little bit later, but that didn't start in a vacuum. That all started. Some would suggest that wars are the greatest things for humanity in terms of creating, evolving technology. But you just don't have a war to get better technology. But deep on the heels with that was, of course, Charles Darwin, and there was a chapter that Robert Wolfgren said, leave that chapter out, Rick, put it in another thing. It was on religion and science in that period of time. And then you come into Kellogg's time, and we can't look at Kellogg and White in a vacuum. You've got to understand that they were impacted by what was going on, because they were both reading. They were getting very heavily impacted by what was going on around. And Ellen was saying, we've still got to stick with this. This is what we're here about. And John was saying, yeah, but hang on a minute. There's other agencies having an impact on the way we think, and we've got to change with the times. I don't know how closely they were aligned, but I see John's intellect was moving very fast. And he was being occasioned by European thinkers. So he was outside the box in my thinking, way outside the box, and leading in ways that most other Adventists didn't even understand him. Can I just say that? Sorry, can I just read? Two of the gentlemen here actually wrote a what do you call it? The recommendation for the book, no, I won't read it to you. You can read it yourself, folks. I just found out, I didn't know, but Amazon.com.au, if you like ebooks, $11. How lousy of them.
What's the book called?
7-Day Adventist Health Reform, A Crucible of Identity Tensions. If you just put Rick Ferret publications, whatever the cheapest price you can find it for, get it. Don't pay me.
I don't like the ebook, so I've got the
you've got to have this one.
Yeah.
Peter.
Thank you. Reflection and then question. It was interesting what you were saying about, Kellogg wanted to divorce the health side of things and medical work from the denomination, and Ellen saying no, they should all be presented and tied together. And it made me think sanitarium health food products don't have Bible quotes or anything on their labels. It's all very just profit. And we were talking about, and was saying that apparently a study before showed nowadays about 50% of Adventists are vegetarian and 50% aren't. And apparently down at the hospital now they do serve meat in the cafeteria as well. So my question, another comment was perfectionism. You've got a strain of last generation theology that draws perfectionistic, tendencies from Ellen. And then you mentioned about John being quite perfectionistic around physical health. And I've never understood, or thought that, but some people are very, I shouldn't use the word rabid, but about their, health message.
They are rabid.
And rabbit as well. And I don't know the history, but where did the vegetarianism stream of Adventism come from? Was that Ellen? Was it Kellogg? Because it's not in any of our fundamental beliefs. You don't have to sign up to be vegetarian. We were talking this morning that culturally in Western Adventist churches, Sabbath lunch, some people might get their feathers ruffled if someone brought chicken or lamb or something. But in Solomon Island churches, it's no problem. So where did that come from? And just interesting.
I think the vegetarianism would have come clearly from Ella White in the earlier years, the Ostego vision, the various visions. My last reading was worldwide 28% of Adventists were vegetarian. So whether it's increased or decreased, I'm not sure.
I think it's decreased, Rick. I was at one of my last college chapels that I attended before I retired. There was a week of prayer or a week of devotion. It was a special function, and there'd been some ongoing quiz being run during the week. and it was time for the big prize. So two of the students came up. Turned out that the winners were announced, and the big prize was a big tub of KFC fried chicken. There was a little buzz went round the not a big one, but enough for the guy to have a bit of a slight double take and said, of course, grain fed. On another occasion, we decided at Avondale College Church we would have a big potluck with all age groups, because this group had been doing it and this group had been doing it, let's do it together. And it was agreed that certain of the younger group would provide soup. And so the soups were there. One of them was a chicken soup, I think, and it was a big pot. And of course, a lot of the older folks in the church, it was duly all announced and so. And at the end of it, my wife, who was there helping coordinate, was talking with some of the other people present, and they said everyone must have had plenty to eat, because there's this huge pot of soup hardly been touched. So there is a shift here, I think, among us, but that's incidental and anecdotal to the thing, to the point.
I think the other point you're stressing is the one, and it's the more about if you have a premillennialist movement that says we have a message to giving out that message, and time becomes a factor as much as we try and argue. I think there's been as many books written on why the Lord hasn't come in Adventism than probably another topic. One of the itchy points for Adventism is what we tend to do as humans say, who's to blame? I honestly think the last generation is asking that question. There's got to be a reason the Lord hasn't come. And we look amongst our churches and say, oh, I think we've got it. And they'll argue that that's not the case, fair enough, but that's peculiar to premillennials, that sort of thinking. The Lord, and particularly Adventism, we thought he'd be here by now. How many generations have thought he'd be here now? There's got to be a rationale he's not here. And we try and humanise that, and oftentimes we say, well, there's got to be someone responsible for that, or some group responsible, or we're not doing well enough, so perfectionism starts driving. But you're right, Kellogg got into his own style of perfectionism. Health perfection, yeah.
Salvation by eating.
Yeah, pretty well.
Yeah.
Eating well.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Fascinating stuff. Did you do much on Kellogg and A.G. Daniels?
No, I didn't, Barry. I know, but Gil Valentine did a fair bit on that. But I didn't want to delve into individual sort of stuff. But I've read the book. But I wanted to have a broader look at the tensions, the bigger tensions surrounding it. So I didn't specifically do that.
Daniels was probably the key power broker.
Yes.
During the whole period.
Yeah.
And there's some fascinating stuff going right back, as I think you said, back into the 18. Well, when he first went back to America, of course, 1901.
Yeah.
From there through to 1907, when Kellogg eventually left, or was asked to leave. Very interesting stuff there, and of course Ellen White comes into that, but that's for another dissertation.
Yeah, not by me. No, not by me.
Yeah, Rick, I've got this is related. It seems to me as I'm listening to you that Kellogg's understanding of the nature of human beings is something of an issue that's going on here, and it seems to me that perhaps he has a too much of a positive view of the nature of human beings, so that he seems to imagine that if you just keep sharing the gospel through health, that people are going to improve and become better. And what I'm wondering here is, has Darwin's evolutionary theory impacted his understanding of human nature? And do you think I'm right in suggesting his understanding of human nature is...
That's a thesis for you to follow up, Mark.
Not happening.
I'd be really interested in following Kellogg and Hitler. With eugenics and that, because I think, but like I said, Mark, I don't know how. I didn't read enough on that side of it to know how the philosophies coming across from that, how he was buying into them. But you're right. He had a view of bodily perfection, devoid of any theological, Adventist theological rationale. Just trying to achieve the same thing for different directions.
Yeah, thanks, Rick, for your presentation. Did you get the sense, after reading letters and that Kellogg was pushed to extremes because of the way he was handled? Was there more sit-down talk, or was there more letter writing? Because some of the letter writing could push a person. There were extremes sometimes.
I don't know what your perception is, but I think Kellogg would have been a difficult character to sit with. He was an educated man. He disdained clergy most of the time. So if that's a given because of what was going on, the unhealthy clergy, if that's a given, it's a very hard place to then sit down and have a meaningful negotiation because he's already put the line in the sand. Most of mine I found through the written word. In fact, Ellen, I think, someone might correct me on this. Did Ellen write a number of letters to John that she never delivered?
Yes.
And
I think in some cases there's a couple that he complained
he didn't get
until
later on.
Published later that he never got.
Yeah. And I think that's the human side of the relationship. If it was devoid of that, you wouldn't think it would have been, I'll just cut him off. But there was this motherly, they nurtured this boy right up. And so, as a parent, what do you do with an erring, wayward child, a wayward boy? And so I think she was traumatised by that. And yet she was also cognizant of the fact that this, in her thoughts, this is why the Adventist Church exists. So I think not only was there a tension, like Barry, you said, between the administrators, and not only was there a tension with Ellen White and John Harvey Kellogg, there's certainly tensions between Ellen and James, we know that. But I think there was tensions in Ellen herself.
Rick, while Ellen White was living here, she was developing this institution, Avondale, and she was asking Kellogg for funds because Battle Creek was sort of the harbinger of coin. And Kellogg's answer to her was that he had so many people that he was feeding in Chicago, and you alluded to it a second ago, the social gospel that he sort of took under his wing and was really, could you say more about that social gospel and how he really delved into that? And it made, it infuriated Ellen White because she was trying to establish this place.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find, I'd love to find out, you might have to read about some of the statistics. John was really clear, to me was really clear in his mind. Theology wasn't the end all and be all, deed is. So you preach a doctrine, but if it has no end place to sit and is not meaningful and functioning in society, you're doing nothing. So we know that Battle Creek, the funds that it involved were far greater, and the employees were much more than the General Conference had at the time, and that's what got Ellen quite upset. They were absorbing a lot of money and a bit of debt and all of that. You'll have to read the chapter on his understanding of the social, what we would call the social gospel. But he was fully out there in society and doing things in the Chicago slums that had never been seen before. They were creating facilities for people to have a wash, to bathe, to shower, certain therapies, massage, and funded a lot of this, self-funded a lot of this. I think that's the other side of John a little bit too. He self-funded a lot of stuff, but he also called for a fair bit of money. But he was functional. If it wasn't seen in real, so the clergy out there preaching this big end time remnant theology, and what are you doing? All you're doing is preaching. And he's saying, look at what I'm doing. I'm actually helping people. And so for him, that became the prominent, the dominant theme. Don't talk to me if you're not doing this. That's how. And then when the clergy, there's where the battle come in. Don't talk to me. You're not going to run this institution. You're not doing a thing. All you're doing is out there preaching.
Is that why they named it Battle Creek?
Yeah.
Battle between them.
Yeah.
Hey Rick, thanks so much for a really stimulating presentation. I'm just really interested in reflecting on the current vibe in Adventism, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of a personal bio. Early in my life, a couple of years out of Avondale, I finished up at Sydney Adventist Hospital as Public Relations Director, which was intriguing. A little later, I went to Andrews, but then down to Dayton, Ohio, where the Adventist Church had just, with lots of money from the Charles Kettering of self-starter automobiles fame, had built a huge medical and educational edifice there, and I studied there for 6 months. And later, again, lived in Southern California, which is a classic demonstration of the nexus between health institutions and Adventist vitality. I think John Harvey Kellogg has had the last laugh. I think, from my experience in some hospitals that I really loved, there was a fantastic engagement with the community, and it's true, a certain muting of like apocalyptic fervour and other things that evangelists wish we would all evidence. But the vitality of Adventism, I don't think the East Coast of the USA loves the nature of West Coast vitality, but it's a very vital, engaging faith, as is the faith of many of my friends in and around Wahroonga and Dayton, Ohio. So I think we did not shed the Kellogg emphasis, we absorbed it, and if you ask any of my really admirable Adventist pastor friends in the One Project, and notice how they've all survived and flourished in Adventism, it's by being employees of the Adventist health system.
That's a good point. I think Lyle's made a really significant... Can I just read something here? Dave Fielder of the book, how do you pronounce it, folks? DeZozo. Reversing the Worst Evil. So here's a paradigm within the church. Concludes his discussion declaring that on an individual level, Adventist members and ministers must reignite the 19th century blueprint concerning the yellow and white medical missionary model. You getting what I'm saying here, folks? In their local communities, demonstrated originally. Perhaps an equally pressing concern involves the ability for Adventist health institutions to navigating a world entirely different from that of Jesus Christ and Ellen White's era. Folks, one of our big problems is change, understanding change. Fielder laments the role that the American Medical Association has exerted on the Loma Linda Hospital in California, declaring, in quotes, "But did the dragon of Revelation 12 use the AMA to distort our perception of God's call for a blended gospel medical missionary evangelism? It does not seem that way to me." The author, while acknowledging the serious challenges facing contemporary Adventist health institutions, states, "What to do about those challenges? In my ignorance, I will keep silent except to pray for those who face them." Linda, just let me finish on this one, because I think Lyle's raised the question. This is how I summarised it. It would appear that the SDA healthcare system, including institutions, is in important ways much closer to the Kellogg model in the Western world than to Ellen White's, for the system has long since abandoned features of White's program, including ministerial pay for physicians, drugless therapy, sexual segregation in doctor-patient relationships, and many others. Adventist hospitals are confederated in business-like organisations that dwarf the Kent General Conference. They do, however, and this was Bevan who wrote this, meet the goals of James White and Kellogg. So what I find interesting is I think sometimes we have a hagiographic view of our history. It's meant to be like this, but when we get into the functionality of what happens in our movement, it's nothing to be afraid of or fearful of. It's just that we're traversing the earth like everyone else. And we have principles and we try and abide with them. But Arthur Patrick said it best, we struggle with change. We struggle with change. We like the good old days and we observe everything often through those lenses. For me, the hardest thing is navigating change appropriately. And being honest about it. Being really honest about it.
We ought to stop our questions now, but you'll be around, Rick, and you can
That's not nice.
talk to a couple of people.
Look, thank you for
We'll get you to give us a benediction in just a moment. But there are many things that we could take away from the presentation today, Rick, but one of them that comes home very closely to me is that not only did we as a church face conflict back there in the early 20th century on what would be our major emphasis, Adventist distinctives and evangelism in the conventional sense, or else a slightly broadened, more social approach to saving people, so to speak. Those decisions have not gone away. I face them. We all face them every day. I have $1 in my hand. How much do I give to the evangelistic effort? How much do I give to ADRA?
Yep. And look, that's the reality. And I think it's better to face the reality through prayer and working through it as a religious community than meandering and tandering off into all these different directions of independency and say it's much more difficult to make change within. You can't do it from the outside. So a lot of my friends said, Rick, why are you still in this old church? You studied it, you can see how crazy they are. I said, so what? I still believe God's got his hand in things. But I would just rather sit down like we're doing now and have a discussion and even have disagreements and say, all right, we're just going to manoeuvre through this. But the tensions are still exactly there as they have been right throughout history. There. Dear Lord, thank you that we can discuss things that are important to some of us at least, and some of the traverses that this movement has struggled with, Lord. I have no doubts in my mind that you know the forest. We want to know the trees all the time, but we just don't see that clearly. But may we stay with you and connect with you, and in the same way connect with others in ways that's living and show them your righteousness that will draw them to you, Lord. May we keep our minds open, and may we challenge change and try and understand it, not to thwart it, but where it's appropriate to make the right moves in the right direction. I ask in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Thank you all so much for coming. It's vindicated our idea that we would still like something